Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Macro Snapshot. We are Tuesday, October the 21st, 2025, recording this in the morning. Okay, let's just have a quick look and see what's going on. I just want to start off. There's a little bit of sort of positivity in the US stocks just at the moment, and that could just be because we had the earnings of Zions. Remember that regional bank? There were some concerns about credit quality and that, there's going to be a repeat of what we saw in, when was it, 2023 with the SVB and sort of bad debt and everything. The comments of Jamie Dimon from JP Morgan talking about where there's one cockroach, there are probably other cockroaches. So the point is that what we saw over the last few days, you can see here the KRE, which is the, as you can see, the regional banking ETF, and you saw that had a couple of nasty drawdowns, but it subsequently sort of pushed back, and you can see that in this morning's pre-market trade, 60.58 up a little bit. So we had Zion last night, and yes, that they have had some drawdowns for so some bad loans tied to fraudulent activity. So, is this a systemic problem? It seems not. So there's this whole sort of narrative of cockroaches in the system and horrible credit and cracks in the credit worthiness of these regional banks is for the moment has been brushed aside. It's so it would seem. And so we're seeing a little bit more risk on, as I say, things like the KRE, or if we just then go to sort of something like equities, you can see here that equities like the ES here, it had that sort of nasty drop, obviously from Trump, hit the 50-day moving average and now sort of pushed up on the back of the sort of the so-called all clear from the the regional banks and whatnot. Secondly, what we've also had is it seems to be a calming of the rhetoric between China and the US. We obviously about a week, 6, 7, 8 days ago, we had a lot of back and forth with Trump and the Chinese counterparts. But since then, Besant has kind of calmed the waters a little bit. Trump himself has said that 100% tariffs are not sustainable. There's still a plan for Trump to meet China's president at the end of this month. So, things are looking sort of a little calmer. And now also what we're getting today, and this could be the next thing, is that we have an in-person meeting between Besant and what's his name, Li Feng, who is the vice president of China. And if there's positive, maybe not sort of, necessarily substantive information coming from that, but if there's a positive sentiment coming from that, something along the lines of, oh, we're working together, it's complicated, but we're going to make a deal. Both sides have to give that, something relatively positive, or at least not negative. And I think you could see sort of equities pushing to, new highs here as well. And if we look at something like the NASDAQ, you also see that sort of around new highs. You see the Russell, not quite as strong, but still doing relatively well. So, part of that is also going to be earnings. And we're starting to get a slew of earnings. Let's have a quick look. As I say, yesterday we got the Zions, which sort of came in, relatively well. Coca-Cola this morning, GE Aerospace, 3M. I mean, a lot of big companies, Northrop Grumman, Netflix, obviously, is a big one for consumer sentiment, Texas Instruments. So we're starting to get some big ones here, IBM later in the week, Hilton, Intel, American Airlines. So start getting a sort of Ford, start getting a sense of what's going on. And of course, next week, we start to get some of the big sort of tech companies. So all in all, I would say a cautious, maybe risk on is a slightly sort of strong word for it. Let's look at some specific stuff. This morning we have I was going to say the Bank of Canada, but it's not actually, it's the Canadian CPI. So you can see here, first of all, talking about the Bank of Canada, the Bank of Canada is meeting on the same day as the Fed at the end of this month, the 29th of October. And as you can see here, almost about 80% chance of a further cut priced in. So 19.6 basis points or 78% chance of a cut. Now, keep in mind that the Bank of Canada has cut substantially, a lot more than the Fed. And Canada, the overnight rate's down to about 2.5%. Compare that to the Fed, which is at about 4.11 as of yesterday. So, there's still about 160 basis points of difference there. But the problem is that Canada, there's still, like the surveys are showing a lack of business confidence. There's a lack of investment, employment, just trying to figure out what's going on with the US in terms of the trade war and tariffs and whatnot. And the Bank of Canada has made it very clear that their emphasis is not so much on inflation, but really on growth and the employment market. Now, we did get relatively good sort of employment numbers out of Canada last time round, but still, as long as the inflation today is not too nasty, I think the Bank of Canada will go ahead and cut. And that's the point. So, what would be nasty? Remember that the Bank of Canada does like to look at the core numbers, so the trim and the medium. And as long as it stays around this 3%, it's probably a little high for comfort for the Bank of Canada, but not so much as to derail them from supporting the real economy, jobs, and growth and whatnot. And so let's keep an eye on that. If you look at the non-seasonally adjusted month-over-month number, actually sort of deflationary, minus a tenth. But if you look at the year-over-year, 2.2 and into the threes for the yearly core numbers. So a little bit elevated and at the top, the topmost range. Of where the Bank of Canada wants to be. But having said that, bar any surprises, I can't see the Bank of Canada not cutting, especially as the market, as we see, is priced in 80% chance. Having said that, if we do get an outlier this morning, that this pricing may go down. So anything, let's say 3.3, 3.3, something, much hotter than expected, that could be a problem and could support the Canadian dollar, which has been a little bit under pressure, as we all know, probably the least favored G10 currency at the moment. So just talking about some of these currencies, overall, the dollar index is kind of clawed back a little bit. You see here a nice little sort of wave movement here going up here, Fib extent, and then a Fibonacci extension, 200-day moving average rejected, came back down into the 100 and the other moving averages. Now at this sort of Fib level here, it seems to have got a bit of a bounce and pushing a little bit higher. Now, does this have the energy to push higher? If we actually sort of move out here, essentially we seem to be, it's an interesting one. Are we just in a trade range, so this kind of box here, some kind of trade range, or is this actually sort of a basing formation, and we can see higher lows and whatnot, and sort of a double bottom retest which has sort of failed, and so the dollar pushing up. It's possible it's just going to be a long grinding sort of stabilization here, neither weakening substantially nor ripping, shall we say, and that's probably just going to be a function of sentiment, trade, tariff sentiment, trade deals, and also what the Fed is doing. But the Fed at this point are in the blackout mode. And it looks as though one cut is more or less a done deal for the next meeting coming up in about 10 days or so, and then a further cut at the end of the year. So that's where we are there. But just on this sort of a bit more sort of a positive risk, we can see something like the Australian dollar. Now the Aussie dollar for me is a little interesting here. I wonder what's going on there. Just staying in the range. I personally thought that would have bounced perhaps after the rare earths deal, which was announced yesterday between Australian Prime Minister Albanese and Trump. So obviously, what Trump is trying to do here is to strengthen his negotiating position with the Chinese. Basically, part of that was, for example, almost like a memorandum of understanding with Australia, the mining companies, to start producing more raw rare earths, which the US would invest in. So a bit of a sort of a memorandum of understanding. We saw the Australian stock market was up nicely overnight, especially the mining stocks on that news. But the Aussie dollar not really benefiting as such from that, which I find a little bit surprising. And so there's still a bit of muted caution, maybe just worrying about the Besant Li Fang meeting today, waiting for some good news out of that meeting before the Aussie can sort of pick up a little bit. As we say, looking at Canada here, you see on the futures here that Canada, just been sort of grinding lower and lower at about 71 US cents here. So, again, in the absence of any, we'll just put this fib maybe just sort of a slightly longer time frame here. You can see here we're just grinding down from this whole sort of movement down to the 50% fib. Looks like it wants to go down to this area of support around about 70.8. But unless we get some pickup in sentiment and clear signs that the Canadian economy is improving, it looks as though the Canadian dollar is just going to continue to be under pressure. Just this morning, we've got the euro again down a little bit. No particular reason for that. There's not any sort of news. I think it's really more a little bit of strength in the US dollar. If we look across at the yen, now the yen's actually down quite a lot, quite a big fall off. And I wonder if that's just because Takaishi was actually confirmed as prime minister. So, but keep in mind it's a minority government, so it's not a majority LDP government. But basically, I wonder, her policy is in theory a little fiscally expansionary. She's on record as saying that she doesn't really feel the need for a BOJ to hike rates too much more. So the fact that she was confirmed as prime minister, maybe just a little bit of sentiment there, just pushing down the Japanese yen. Having said that, something I would say as a sort of a caveat is that it is a minority government. And so she will not find it super easy to have her own way on all policies. And I'm not sure that she'll be able to, willy-nilly increase spending without any kind of pushback from some of the opposition. Excuse me, just having a sip of tea here. Now, we do have the Bank of Japan next week. Probably they're not going to hike, but who knows? So at this point, just the Japanese yen taking a bit of a pause there, and looks as though maybe might want to come down and retest some of these levels there. If we have a look, I just want to look at the bond situation here. Not a huge amount of going on. We see that what is interesting though is that there was a news report uh, coming out from Bloomberg, essentially saying that some huge investors like BlackRock and State Street, they're no longer using indices with the double A sort of criteria as their benchmark. So before they were saying there's the double A, that there was a minimum kind of a rating. Now we know that France was downgraded by Standard and Poor last Friday to the single A. But if it's the case that huge investors or money managers like sort of BlackRock and State Street are not using the double A as a minimum. That means, in essence, that they can continue their exposure to French debt. And so that's why we may be seeing a little bit of recovery in the debt market. But that's an important one to keep an eye on because, countries like Spain and France to a certain degree, and Italy, although they've improved, they're still under a little bit of pressure. And if these huge sort of investors and funds are not so worried about the a double A rating. That could be a positive overall for for example, like French debt. So that's an interesting one there to look at. In terms of other markets, we have oil just briefly. Oil not doing a lot, just sort of a sideways trading here. Listen, in terms of the Ukraine, Russia, peace deal, Putin, Trump, Putin is resisting. Trump is clearly trying to put pressure on Zelensky to give up some territory in exchange for some kind of a peace deal, trying to get together a meeting for a few weeks in Budapest. Putin is pushing back. We saw Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, push back and just say if they were just to freeze the sort of the front lines where they are at the moment, that would not achieve Russia's objectives. So pouring a little bit of cold water on the possibility of a quick resolution to that conflict. And as long as that's the case, oil maybe is not free to sort of fall too dramatically, because oil at this point has this sort of conflicting conflicting factors that obviously it seems to be a little bit too much oil is being produced. There's a huge amount of oil in storage just floating around, so both on onshore and offshore sort of storage tanks. And basically at this point, it seems that the path of least resistance for oil probably should be a little bit lower. But as long as there's a bit of geopolitical risk and there's still no resolution in the Russia-Ukraine conflict, oil, maybe is free just to sort of be in this holding pattern here. And as you can see, there's quite a lot of support here around about 56 and three quarters in the WTI. Just finally, want to look at some of the precious metals here. Gold is coming off. Now we all know that this is massively oversold. And we also have in India the Diwali sort of a jewelry buying sort of holiday seems to be coming to an end. The short squeeze in London seems to be also sort of ending as sort of some physical silver metal is flowing into the coffers in the London Metal Exchange. So silver had a pretty nasty dump here, and it's going to be interesting to see. That's at the 20-day moving average here, a bit of resistance a bit further down. And if we start looking at some levels here, could silver have a much more dramatic sort of fallback? So if we look just here, we can start throwing some sort of fibs. You can see that there's pretty good support, a lot of congestion here around about the 47.5 mark. So that's an interesting level. Obviously down here at 43, let's call it about $44. That's another big level as well at the 50-day moving average. So there's definitely some nice support levels here. It's going to be interesting to see if the bulls come in. Was this just a short squeeze? Will gold be picked up? This is interesting. Also copper having a bit of just on the back of some of those metals coming down, and the industrial metal of copper coming down. Remember, we've got the plenum, the fourth plenum happening in China as well. And if the market doesn't get any sort of strong sense of sort of like a serious sort of a stimulus package coming out of that meeting, which ends in a few days, it goes basically during this week. Copper could also just find itself range bound. Although again, the medium term prognosis for copper is positive. There's still quite a lot of outages from in Indonesia, that huge mine of a Freeport McMoran. also over in Chile. So there's definitely sort of outages and production restrictions, which is positive for copper. And of course, we all know the story about AI and electrification of the grid and whatnot in a sort of a bigger picture thing. So interesting to see what happens with copper here. But as I say, at the moment, it's keeping an eye on cousins in the precious metal space and also what's happening in China. Okay, guys, probably the main thing today is the news coming out of the meeting in China between, not in China, but between Li Fang of China, the vice premier, and Besant. Also, we have the Canadian CPI coming up in about 35 minutes or so. And of course, any headlines coming in from our friend Trump. Okay, I'll leave it there, guys. Have a great day, and we'll keep this going tomorrow. Thank you.